Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Life Up Podcast. Let's start your day with positive thoughts and talks. Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling like you just weren't getting through to the other person at all?
Yeah.
Like, you had all your reasons, maybe even facts and figures to back you up, but it just felt like you were talking to a wall.
Right.
That frustration of feeling disconnected even when you're armed with information.
Oh,
I
wow.
think we've all been there.
Absolutely.
Well, today we're going to offer you a bit of a shortcut, a deep dive into how to actually bridge those gaps in communication and connect more genuinely in your conversations.
Yeah, we've been really digging into Jefferson Fisher's book, The Next Conversation. Argue less, talk more.
Oh, interesting.
And what's really fascinating about Fisher is that his background is as a trial lawyer.
Okay.
So he's coming from this world of inherently adversarial situations.
Yeah.
But his message is all about moving beyond that combat, that fight to win mentality in our everyday interactions.
I like that. It's like taking those skills from a high-stakes environment and applying them to daily life.
Exactly.
So what we want to do today is actually pull out some of the most practical, immediately applicable insights from his book
Okay.
to help you, the listener, just navigate conversations with more understanding, less conflict.
Right.
We're not getting bogged down in the academic theory.
Yeah,
We want to give you those tools you can actually use right away.
absolutely.
So let's jump in, shall we?
Let's do it.
All right. So one of the things that Fisher really emphasizes right off the bat is this idea of rethinking, the whole goal of a conversation.
Okay.
He says we often get stuck in this mindset that every conversation is a competition to win.
Right.
We need to prove we're right, the other person's wrong, and just get our point across no matter what. But he argues that sales pitch of winning is not only kind of played out, but also sets us up for failure more often than not.
Yeah, and we see that all the time, especially online.
Oh, absolutely.
People getting into these heated debates on social media,
Yes.
throwing facts and figures at each other, trying to prove their point.
It's like a constant battle of who has the most data, the most retweets.
Right.
But how often does anyone actually change their mind based on that kind of exchange?
Rarely.
Exactly.
Because the focus becomes all about scoring points.
Yeah.
And it's not about understanding why someone else sees things the way they do.
Right. It's like the understanding gets completely lost in the fight for the win.
Right. So Fisher actually suggests, making a shift.
Okay.
Instead of striving for that victory, he says the real goal should be to try and see through what he calls the keyhole into another person's world.
The keyhole.
Yeah, to actually understand their perspective.
I see.
Their underlying motivations.
So it's more about empathy than ego.
Absolutely. Stop keeping score.
Yeah.
Because the real win, he says, is understanding.
Right.
It's not dominance.
And he also talks about those conversations that, maybe didn't go as planned.
Yeah.
The arguments, the disagreements.
Right.
He actually reframes those as valuable feedback rather than total losses.
No, that's interesting.
Right. Because they highlight, he says, areas where our communication could be stronger.
That's a good point.
So we're not just focused on being right in that moment.
Yeah.
It's about learning, about growth, and ultimately it's about paving the way for a more meaningful connection down the line.
Right. So it's not the end of the world if that first conversation goes sideways a little bit.
Exactly.
It's about what you do next.
Yeah. And speaking of what you do next, that leads us to another really interesting concept that Fisher introduces, this idea of the next conversation.
Okay.
He points out that those initial heated exchanges, when things get really intense, they often just reach a standstill
Yeah.
because everyone's so caught up in the emotion of the moment, in defending their position. And we've all been there, right? Things get heated, maybe something gets said, that stings a little bit.
Right.
And the whole thing just kind of derails.
Yeah.
But Fisher suggests that the real opportunity for progress often lies in that next conversation after some time has passed to cool down and reflect.
So don't necessarily give up if that first conversation didn't go so well.
Exactly. Don't let that heated moment be the final word.
Yeah.
Because that follow-up, he says, offers a chance to kind of reframe what happened.
Okay.
Maybe offer an apology if it's needed.
Right.
Or even just find a way to, inject a little bit of humor and diffuse the tension.
Right.
And he shares this really relatable example in the book about a text exchange over lunch plans.
Okay.
Where, things escalate because one person felt like an apology was due, but it wasn't given right away.
Right.
It just shows how even those attempts to reconnect can kind of go wrong if those unspoken expectations aren't addressed.
Mm-hmm.
And the takeaway there, I think, is this. That those later conversations often have so much more potential for real connection.
Yeah.
Because people feel safer.
Right.
More willing to express their genuine feelings once that initial pressure has kind of subsided.
Yeah.
And that space allows for more honesty, more vulnerability,
Yeah.
and ultimately a much greater chance of actually repairing and strengthening that connection.
Right. So it's about kind of like giving each other that space to process
Absolutely.
before jumping back in.
Yeah. So moving on, Fisher talks a lot about this concept of identifying your conversation values.
Okay, conversation values.
Right. And he describes them as these guiding principles, almost like your North Star in any interaction. So it's not just about the outcome of the conversation, but about how you want to show up, like who you want to be in that interaction.
Right. It's about more than just getting your way.
Exactly. He gives the example of valuing honesty and also the importance of feeling heard. So even if someone asks you, is everything okay? At the end of a tense exchange, if you don't genuinely feel heard,
Right.
you respond truthfully instead of just saying yes to avoid further conflict.
You're saying what you really mean instead of what you think is easier.
Precisely. So these values, things like respect, empathy, clarity, honesty, these are like your non-negotiables in communication.
And they can really guide your behavior in conversations
Exactly.
and not just, the outcome.
Right. Because ultimately, when your actions align with your values,
Yeah.
you're going to be better equipped to achieve your goals for that conversation, even before it starts.
You're showing up authentically as yourself.
Right. And he even gives a really practical example of this. He talks about making a conscious effort to listen without interrupting, or without immediately formulating your rebuttal in your head.
I know I'm guilty of that.
Oh, we all do it. But by simply allowing the other person to feel heard and understood, he says they often become much more receptive to your perspective when it's your turn to speak.
Oh, that's interesting. It's about creating that space for reciprocal understanding.
Exactly. And to help you, prepare for your own conversations.
Yeah.
Fisher recommends asking yourself 2 key questions. First, what do I hope to achieve in this conversation? And second, which of my core values will help me reach that goal while staying true to myself?
So it's about being intentional.
Absolutely. Be intentional and be clear about what truly matters to you in that interaction.
Right.
Right. So we've talked about, moving beyond this need to win, the power of the next conversation, using our values as a guide.
Yeah.
Now, Fisher dives into this idea of the truth about connection, and he stresses that awareness is absolutely critical.
Okay.
And he starts with something that I think might surprise a lot of people.
Yeah.
That self-awareness is often the hardest form of awareness to achieve.
It is.
Because we often have this perception, right, of how we come across, but we can be completely oblivious to our own nonverbal cues, our tone of voice, our fidgeting, even our facial expressions.
Yeah.
And these signals, these subtle things, they can unintentionally create tension or misunderstanding
Right.
without us even realizing it.
We're sending mixed messages without knowing it.
Exactly. He gives this great example of someone, looking really stressed after a tough phone call,
Okay.
and then unknowingly making a colleague feel like they've done something wrong just from a simple greeting in the hallway.
Right.
It's just that lack of awareness of our own signals, and it can have a huge impact on our relationships.
And he says, it goes beyond just our own signals.
Okay.
It's also about being aware of the difference in perspective. It's not just about disagreeing on a point,
Right.
but genuinely trying to understand why someone holds a certain view.
That's a really crucial distinction.
It is, because it's so easy to dismiss an opinion that differs from our own.
Yeah.
But taking the time to actually want to understand the reasoning behind it, that's where true understanding, empathy can begin to develop.
It's about recognizing that there's a story behind every viewpoint.
Exactly. Now, to move from these kind of like abstract ideas to practical application,
Okay.
Fisher introduces this concept of what he calls functional thinking in communication.
Functional thinking.
Yeah. And he basically says, relying on general advice like be empathetic isn't enough.
Right.
We need concrete actions.
Yeah. We need a how-to.
We need the how-to. So he actually draws an analogy from math,
Okay.
specifically how changing one variable in an equation affects the outcome,
Okay.
but he makes it really accessible.
Good.
So functional thinking is essentially about observing the cause and effect relationships in our interactions.
Right.
And he uses everyday examples like a coffee maker.
Okay.
You put in grounds and water, you get coffee.
Makes sense.
Or a thermostat, you set a temperature. The room adjusts accordingly.
Right. So you put something in, you get a result.
Exactly.
And you can kind of predict what's going to happen based on those inputs.
Right. So how does this relate to arguments?
Yeah, that's the key question.
He talks about recognizing those predictable patterns in conflict.
Okay.
Specifically, what he calls the ignition phase when things heat up, and the cooling phase when things start to calm down.
I like that.
So just like adding fuel ignites a fire,
Right.
certain words, certain actions can actually escalate a disagreement.
Yeah.
And just like removing fuel lets a fire die down,
Right.
there are communication strategies that can actually de-escalate a conflict and move us towards resolution.
Interesting.
And the key, he says, is to actually start recognizing these patterns.
Yeah.
So we're not just reacting emotionally in the moment.
Right. We're being more strategic, more intentional.
Exactly. And this leads us to another important point, which is understanding our triggers.
Okay.
Because Fisher explains that, when conflict escalates,
Right.
our bodies actually react first through what's called our autonomic nervous system.
Right.
It's that fight or flight response kicking in.
Yeah, that adrenaline surge.
Exactly. And he emphasizes that those moments of friction, when we feel triggered,
Right.
they can actually teach us a lot about ourselves.
Interesting.
What sets us off.
Yeah.
It can reveal our own vulnerabilities, our beliefs, our insecurities.
It's like a signal flare going off.
It is.
So it's about paying attention to those moments.
And it outlines two main types of triggers.
Okay.
Physical triggers, which are really, direct threats to our safety and well-being.
Right.
Things like, someone yelling,
Yeah.
invading our personal space.
Right.
Or physical aggression.
Okay, so those are the really obvious ones.
Yeah. And then you have psychological triggers,
Okay.
which are maybe more common in everyday communication. And these involve, our thoughts and feelings. Maybe it's related to how we're being perceived socially.
Right, that fear of judgment.
Right. Or it could be threats to our sense of self, our competence, our values.
Okay.
Or maybe even the fear of loss, whether it's a relationship or status.
Right.
He gives a really great example, actually, of a psychological trigger related to values.
Okay. What is it?
So, imagine someone criticizes a political figure that you really admire and support,
Okay.
and you find yourself feeling really personally attacked. And that's because you've connected your own values and your own identity to that figure.
Right, so it feels like an attack on you,
Exactly.
not just the person they're criticizing.
Exactly. And he says the key is to start noticing our body's signals.
Okay, so what kind of signals?
Like that tightening in your chest, your voice getting louder, maybe your breathing changes.
Right.
And these aren't necessarily attacks from the other person.
Yeah.
They're data.
Okay.
Data about our own emotional state.
So pay attention to the body.
Pay attention to the body.
Yeah.
And instead of, focusing on winning,
Right.
we need to learn how to respond to our triggers in a way that promotes de-escalation.
Right. So it's about recognizing those triggers and then having a plan for how to respond.
Exactly.
Okay, so we're becoming more aware of our triggers. Now, how do we actually navigate those tense moments in conversations?
Right.
Well, Fisher talks about controlling the moment, and he says that the crucial opportunity often lies in that split second before a conflict fully ignites.
Oh, interesting.
Right. It's like we're so focused on the other person, what they're saying, what we're going to say back,
Right.
that we often miss that chance to regulate our own reaction.
We're just reacting.
Exactly. We're
Okay,
busy
what I-
formulating our arguments, preparing our defenses,
Yeah.
but not paying attention to our internal state.
So what can we do?
Well, Fisher offers 3 really powerful tools to help us seize control in that crucial moment.
Okay, I'm listening.
The first one is this. Your first word is your breath.
Your first word is your breath.
He talks about the immediate calming effect of controlled breathing.
Right.
In through the nose, a longer exhale, establishing a rhythm. Okay. And he even mentions the Navy SEALs and their tactical breathing.
Wow, that's interesting.
Right, as an example of how crucial breath control is under pressure.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So taking that deliberate breath can really disrupt that automatic stress response. And it gives us that moment to kind of regain our footing.
Okay.
So that's the first tool.
What's the second one?
The second tool is your first thought is a quick scan.
A quick scan.
This involves doing a mental check-in with your body from your feet up to your head
Okay.
and noticing any physical signs of tension,
Okay.
Maybe your jaw's clenched, shoulders are tight, heart's racing.
Right.
And then the next step is actually naming the emotion you're feeling.
Oh, interesting. So you're not just noticing the physical sensation.
Oh,
You're actually labeling it.
You're bringing awareness to it.
Okay.
And he says this very quick process can create a moment of clarity and help you regain control.
That makes sense. Just acknowledging those feelings can help diffuse their intensity.
Exactly. And the third tool
Okay.
is your first conversation is a small talk.
Small talk.
And these are short, memorable phrases.
Okay.
Often using verbs that help to kind of direct your mindset and your behavior in tense situations.
Interesting.
He gives the example of find the struggle as a small talk to use when dealing with difficult people.
Oh, I like that.
Right? It's about having that go-to mental phrase that kind of anchors you in your desired approach.
Okay. So it's like a little mantra to help you stay on track.
Exactly. So those are 3 really practical tools, I think, for those critical moments before a conflict really takes hold.
Yeah, I like those. And, I think they lead really well into this other idea that Fisher talks about, which is controlling the pace of a conversation. He really emphasizes the gift of a pause.
The gift of a pause.
Right. And he points out that rushed speech is often a telltale sign of that ignition phase. Our heart rate goes up, our thoughts race, and we tend to speak much faster.
Yeah.
And that often leads to more emotional and less reasoned responses.
We're not thinking clearly.
Right. Our foot is on the brake the whole time.
Yeah.
So it's about consciously choosing to slow down.
And he challenges this idea that we're somehow powerless to control that.
Right.
He says we actually have more control than we think.
Yeah. So how do we get better at it?
Well, he says the value of pausing isn't just about giving ourselves time to, gather our thoughts. It also helps us avoid those knee-jerk emotional reactions.
Right.
And he touches on this really interesting point about our cultural discomfort with silence.
Oh, yeah.
Where we feel compelled to fill every gap with words.
That's like we're afraid of those empty spaces.
Yeah.
But he reframes silence as wisdom in waiting.
Wisdom in waiting. I love that.
Right.
So it's not about rushing to fill the space with words. It's about allowing that silence to, to work its magic.
Because he also suggests that rushing our speech can actually make us seem less confident.
Interesting.
Whereas a deliberate pause can actually project strength and thoughtfulness.
Right. And he actually differentiates between 2 types of pauses. Short pauses,
Okay.
which are great for maintaining focus and allowing the other person to fully express themselves.
Right.
And then longer pauses,
Okay.
which are those, 5 to 10 second stretches. And he says those can be incredibly powerful.
Oh, wow. 5 to 10 seconds, that's a long time.
It is.
But what does that do?
Well, he describes it almost like a mirror,
Okay.
reflecting back what's just been said.
Okay.
So those long pauses not only give us time to process our own thoughts,
Right.
they also compel the other person to kind of reconsider their words. And he talks about how this can be particularly effective when someone's being rude, insulting, or even untruthful.
Okay.
Because the silence allows their words to kind of hang in the air,
Right.
and it often makes them question, what they've actually said.
Interesting. So they have to sit with the weight of their own words.
Exactly. And he shares this really compelling story about an 18-wheeler driver who's being deposed.
Okay.
And, he's being dishonest. And the lawyer uses these strategic long pauses
Okay.
to create enough discomfort
Right.
that the driver actually starts to contradict himself.
Wow.
So it highlights how, truthful individuals are generally comfortable with silence.
Right.
But those who are being deceptive often feel this urge to fill it.
Oh, that's interesting. It's almost like a truth serum.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So the power of the pause.
Right. Okay, so now we know when to pause. What about what we say when we do speak?
Well, that leads us to another really important topic that Fisher covers, developing an assertive voice.
Okay, assertive voice.
And he makes this crucial distinction right away. Confidence is often a byproduct of assertiveness. It's not a prerequisite for it.
That makes sense. So you don't have to feel confident to act assertively.
Exactly.
You act assertively to feel more confident.
Precisely. So it's about taking those assertive actions in our language and our tone that then contribute to our feeling more confident.
Okay.
And he stresses that every word matters.
Every word matters.
The language we use in our emails, our texts, our face-to-face conversations, it directly impacts our ability to assert ourselves.
Okay.
And it shapes how others perceive our authority and our self-respect.
Right. It's about being mindful of the message we're sending.
Absolutely. And he asks us to consider this. Who do your words say you are?
Who do your words say you are?
It's a powerful question.
It is.
And then he delves into some really specific ways that we can actually practice assertiveness in our communication.
Okay, I like that. Give us the how-to.
Right. So one key area is to stop apologizing unnecessarily.
Okay.
And he's not talking about the genuine I'm sorries, when we've made a mistake.
Right.
He's talking about those habitual, sorry to bother you, or I'm so sorry, but phrases.
Oh, yeah, those little qualifiers.
Exactly. And he says we tack these onto our requests or our questions all the time, and they actually undermine our self-esteem.
It's like we're constantly minimizing ourselves.
Exactly. So he says, reserve those sincere apologies for when they're truly warranted.
Okay, what else?
Another crucial lesson is to talk less, say more.
Talk less, say more.
He says over-explaining can actually erode our confidence
Okay.
and the impact of our message.
It's like we're trying to convince ourselves as much as the other person.
Exactly. And often the more words we use, the less believable we sound.
So be concise.
Be concise, be direct.
Okay.
He also advises us to never undersell ourselves.
Okay, what does that mean?
Using phrases that kind of diminish our worth. Like, I hate to bother you, or I might be wrong, but...
Yeah, those little self-deprecating phrases.
Exactly. And finally, he emphasizes the importance of our tone of voice.
Right.
He says that a balanced tone, one that conveys both respect for the other person and self-respect,
Right.
is the cornerstone of assertiveness,
Okay.
as opposed to aggression, which lacks that element of mutual respect.
So it's about being firm but not hostile.
Precisely. All right, so now we've talked about speaking assertively.
Yeah.
Now, how do we navigate those interactions when we encounter rudeness or insults?
Right, that's a tough one.
It is. But Fisher offers some very practical strategies for pushing back without being pushy.
Okay, pushing back without being pushy.
And he explains that often, rude or insulting comments, they're actually driven by a need for dopamine?
Dopamine?
That feel-good neurotransmitter in our brains.
Right, right.
So people might try to belittle others
Yeah.
to feel superior,
Okay.
or to provoke a reaction, to get that dopamine hit.
So they're looking for a rise out of you.
Exactly. So the key, he says, is to not give them that satisfaction.
Don't give them the dopamine.
Don't give them the dopamine. So when someone insults or offends you,
Yeah.
he recommends a deliberate pause
Right, that pause again.
to let their words hang in the air and deny them that immediate reaction they might be seeking.
Okay.
And then he suggests following that pause with a clarifying question about their intent.
Oh, interesting.
So something like, did you mean?
Did you mean?
And then often a silent response.
So you're not engaging in a back and forth.
Exactly. You're calling them out on their behavior, but you're not feeding into that negativity.
Okay, I like that. Now, what about rudeness or dismissive behavior?
Well, for that, he suggests a slightly different approach.
Okay.
He says, first, take a brief pause
Right.
to process their words, and then ask a question to try and understand their intent, and then wait for them to either clarify or apologize.
Right.
And if their intent was clearly negative,
Yeah.
he says, offer silence and disengage.
Walk away.
Exactly. And he points out this works in written communication too, like in emails or texts.
Oh, that's good to know.
Yeah,
Because those can be really tricky.
they can be. And he also gives really specific advice on how to handle those less than genuine apologies.
Yeah, those are worse.
Right. The ones that, lack empathy, offer excuses, or are overly self-pitying.
Right, right.
And for each type, he actually provides a direct and assertive response
Okay.
to kind of steer the conversation back towards genuine accountability.
So it's about setting a standard for how you want to be treated.
Absolutely. And lastly, on this topic, he offers this 3-step approach to managing interruptions in a conversation.
Okay, I definitely need help with this one.
It's a common challenge.
It is.
So first, he says, let the first interruption happen.
Okay.
Don't immediately jump in and try to reclaim your space.
Okay, so let them get it out of their system.
Exactly. Because often that first interruption is just, those impulsive thoughts spilling out.
Yeah,